Hey, future doctors. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Spoonful Sugar, a podcast made for medical students by medical students to help the medicine go down. My name is Trent Henderson, and I'm a student at Des Moines University, and I'll be your host today. This episode is the first in a two-part series on lipids. We will cover how we process them from start to finish, what apolipoproteins are used, and the various lipoproteins. In the next episode, we will cover familial dyslipidemias and some anti-hyperlipidemics to keep cholesterol and triglycerides in check. Throughout this episode, I will ask questions to help reinforce content and put together how different systems work together. While I will include many details that you would find in study resources, our goal this episode is meant as a way to practice some of the high-yield concepts and terms and get exposure to them in a Q&A format. So don't get disheartened if you don't know all of these. It's just practice. Without further ado, let's get started with the clinical vignette. A 10-month boy comes in with his parents after 6 hours of lethargy, vomiting, and seizures. Vitals and physical exam include a heart rate of 130, respiratory rate of 24, and minimal withdrawal from pain. Hepatomegaly is noted. Labs reveal glucose of 18 and metabolic acidosis, yet undetectable ketones. Liver enzymes are mildly elevated. Further testing reveals elevated acylcarnitine levels of the 8 to 10 carbon length that confirm your diagnosis. So, what might cause this? Take a moment to think. So, after this episode, I hope that you'll be able to answer that question and get to know some of the players involved with lipid regulation. First, let's start with digestion. But before we do, let's go over some basics. So, lipids, in general, are compounds that are categorized by structure. What is their unique feature? Good. So they're soluble in non-polar solvents, while insoluble in polar solvents like water. Can you think of an example of a type of lipids? There are quite a few right answers. Good. So there are steroids that are cholesterol derived. There are structural lipids, which include like phospholipids, glycolipids. And additionally, there are triacylglycerol or triglycerides. So that's a good segue into triglycerides. What makes up a triglyceride? Good. So they have a hydrophilic or water-loving glycerol backbone that'll be linked up with 3 lipophilic fat-loving acyl groups. So why is this done? Why do we have this combined unit for storage? So it's good because it's a polarity. While they may be able to dissociate and bind to other compounds such as albumin, basically, the combination here is the best because it combines their amphiphilic properties and it stabilizes them so that these compounds don't interact with others. Okay, so now that we know what a triacylglycerol or triglyceride is, think of what they're used for. Give an example, maybe energy-wise. Okay, it's good. So they're used for energy. We break them down via beta oxidation. They're quite calorie dense, kilocalorie dense, up to 9, which is actually the highest of all the macronutrients. So these will be used heavily in quite a few cases, relatively high in cases like fasting, exercise, or starvation. So now that we have lipids, where does digestion first begin? Like when we consume it, consume ice cream, or any sort of lipid-rich food. Give you a moment. Good. So they're chewed, broken down mechanically, and then they're exposed to kind of some weaker salivary lipases. And then as they go along the digestive tract, they'll be exposed to some stronger pancreatic lipases. This allows the acyl groups to separate from the glycerol backbone and be absorbed, as the unit, the triglycerol, is too big in and of itself to be absorbed. So in the process, we'll get production of diglycerides and monoglycerides. So now that we have this mix, let's say the lumen of the duodenum at this point, what are they mixed with here? Very important. So good, they'll be mixed with bile salts. These will be coming from the biliary system and they're secreted there at the ampulla vater. And what is special about this? Why is this needed for lipids specifically? Okay, good. So they're amphiphilic, and basically they're going to need to be solubilized for absorption and for transport. Kind of think of avoiding like the oil and water phenomenon. Instead, you can get a detergent, kind of like bile, and they'll mix well. So once they're in this form, let's say they've gone to duodenum, they'll be able to be absorbed in the intestinal cells. And what are they renamed at this point? Good. So micelles at this point. This is, the lipids are being processed at this point in the GI system. So after they enter on the apical side, the inner side of the duodenum, they leave on the opposite side, the basolateral side, packaged as. Again, we have a little bit of a different name here. So they enter as micelles, and then they leave as chylomicrons. Again, these are kind of large. Think about like what you just absorbed, a lot of triglycerides. They're going to be fat rich. So next, these triglyceride-rich spherical aggregates, they're going to be transporting their lipid mixtures. This will be like after a meal, and they're going to have to travel where first, like which system? Give you some options: arterial, venous, lymphatic. Okay, so lymphatic is the answer here. Think about it; it makes sense. There tends to be kind of like rich, milky in color, even, and that would be rich in triglycerides. And so these little spheres, what are they going to act like? Is the outside going to be nonpolar? The inside going to be nonpolar? Which side will be polar? Because we know we have sides at this point. Okay, so good. So it's going to have a lipophilic core and it's going to have a hydrophilic outer surface. This will allow like easier transport throughout the body um, and for reprocessing. So if we were to have an issue kind of in this phase of the basolateral surface of the enterocytes, kind of leaving the GI system to go into the lymph, potentially an issue with the microsomal triglyceride transfer protein, what would that be called? It's a particular disease. If you got this, good. A beta lipoproteinemia. Kind of a big word, but it is kind of a specific condition. So, A beta lipoproteinemia is an autosomal recessive disease that causes a deficiency in the ApoB48 and the ApoB100 lipoproteins, which will impair the transport out of enterocytes and into peripheral cells. So, if lipids don't transfer to the lymph and later systemic circulation, what could some problems with this be? Try to name a few. Okay, so if you were thinking anything along the line of steatorrhea due to impaired fat soluble or fat absorption, additionally with fat soluble vitamin deficiencies, that would be correct. In the case of an infant, this could lead to failure to thrive, again, lack of energy. Other potential concerns could be neurological, even, specifically the example of vitamin E. It can be seen in retinitis pigmentosa, a disease characterized by progressive decline in vision. It can also be a part of coagulopathies, ataxia. Um, and so this is something that would need to be treated and just kind of mechanistically, more, maybe not the highest yield point, but if you were to try to treat this, what would you do? Okay, so if we have a vitamin E deficiency, what we'd want to do is we'd want to supplement this with alpha tocopherol, which is the only biologically active isoform of vitamin E, and then also low dietary fat to avoid the long chain fatty acids that would be difficult to absorb. So it makes sense because they can't leave the enterocyte. So if they never enter, they won't build up. So now that we're here, issues with absorbing lipids, can you think of another condition, potentially a little different, but that might lead to vitamin deficiencies, steatorrhea, malabsorption? It affects people in childhood and throughout life. Okay, so if you were thinking cystic fibrosis due to decreased pancreatic enzymes, including lipases, which I said were important for absorption, that would be correct. However, there are actually quite a few conditions that will have issues with this step. If you said something like celiac sprue, Crohn's disease, Whipple disease, or an extensive bowel resection, that would also be correct. So, assuming normal transfer of micelles to the lymphatic system and then to the liver, further on, some repackaging will need to happen. So, just to recap, we are now at the liver, and this is kind of like a central station of where things are going to be able to be processed. We've brought our initial micelles, turned them into chylomicrons, sent them for the lymph, now came to the liver, and now they need to be repackaged. Give you a moment to process that. Okay, so next, now that we're at the liver, what it's going to do is it's going to repackage the triglycerides and cholesterols into some larger units called very low density lipoproteins, VLDLs. And it's going to do that with an apolipoprotein, kind of like a tag, could be like a protein. They can be multifunctional, but this one that you want to remember is ApoB100 paired with VLDLs. We'll come back to the B100 part, but what's important to know is what VLDLs are rich in. What are they rich in? Okay, so VLDLs are rich in triglycerides. If you said size, that would also be right because these are going to start really large. They're going to have like a lot of, they're basically fat globules. And so what they're going to be doing is they're going to be breaking down in size. Um, and at first, they start out with a really high amount of triglycerides, and proportionally or inversely, they'll have a low amount of what? Okay, cholesterol, because cholesterol is kind of our baseline. It needs it for structure, but these are loaded with triglycerides. So in descending order, we're going to start with our VLDLs, and then as they break down, they're going to become intermediate density lipoproteins, IDLs, and then after that, they'll become low density lipoproteins. Overall, I think this is probably worth something memorizing. Generally, the molecules get smaller and denser, and as they go along. So what you need to know is they're basically similar compounds. They just have different ratios of proteins, cholesterols, triglycerides, and phospholipids. Long story short, you don't need to memorize that, but just know that they have different combinations, and they have different roles too. So, like I said, the VLDLs, kind of the initial step of delivering triglycerides. The LDLs are smaller, and they'll tend to deliver more cholesterol. And then even smaller, we have the high density lipoprotein. And that's actually going to return cholesterol to the liver from the periphery. Okay, so now let's go over apolipoproteins. We just described a lot of lipoproteins, not to be confused with apolipoproteins, very similar names. Um, but the apolipoproteins are kind of like the tags. Some names are like ApoB100, ApoC2. They often have APO in the name, so that's an easier way to remember them. So they act like ID badges to get lipids to the right places and to be processed correctly. They're smaller and they're part of lipoproteins. So these will be part of the bigger lipoproteins, like we just talked about. So, give you a moment. So, okay, so our first apolipoprotein is ApoB48. Do you remember what that is important for? I've mentioned it once already. Okay, good. So it's secreted from the intestine to mediate the secretion of chylomicrons from enterocytes into the lymphatics. So this is basically its ID badge saying, hey, I can leave the GI system and go into circulation in the lymphatic system. So I like to think of like a big B-48 bomber. These are going to be large. They're trying to leave. And that's pretty much all I need to know about them. Next, we have this coming from the liver. It's a little different, not the GI system. This is coming from the liver, ApoB100. So what ApoB100 is going to do is it's going to mediate the attachment of LDL. Remember we talked about that. It's basically delivering cholesterol to LDL receptors. So what it's going to do is it's basically helping the LDLs attach to its receptors. And I like to remember this as like you 100% need ApoB100 to get LDL across. And this will come up again later, but this is pretty important. You do want the LDL receptors to be working to take up LDL, which will lower your systemic LDL. And this is something we can measure. So we'll repeat that a little bit later. But moving on, ApoC2, basically what this does, can you remember? This one's kind of difficult. A lot of people remember it as cuts and cleaves or some sort of other CC because you want to remember that it activates lipoprotein lipase, an enzyme there that's going to facilitate the hydrolysis of triglycerides contained within like chylomicrons and VLDL. So what that's going to do is it's basically just going to cut and cleave these really large chylomicrons, VLDL. They've got tons of triglycerides in them, and it's going to allow the body to basically separate these fatty acids and start to absorb them. Since you can't just take a VLDL or a chylomicron and absorb that cellularly, you have to cut it into pieces smaller. So this one again, ApoC2, is to cut and cleave. So this one is very important, as I just mentioned, and there's actually some hormone that can help with this. And do you know what that would be? Okay, good. So insulin promotes lipoprotein lipase expression. ApoC2 activates lipoprotein lipase. So in combination, insulin is going to be cutting these or helping in the processing of cutting basically the VLDLs, chylomicrons. And that makes sense because in a fed state where you're going to have insulin, you're going to want to be able to be processing these, have the cells be able to process these and absorb them. So again, insulin promotes LPL expression, which is then activated by ApoC2. Okay, so next we have ApoE. I like to think of this one just simply as eats the remnants. Apo eats. Do you remember what this one does? So this one is basically the liver eating. ApoE mediates the hepatic uptake of chylomicron remnants and IDL by acting as a ligand for liver receptors, enabling clearance of these lipoprotein particles from circulation. So what does that mean? So that means that basically once these large VLDL turn into IDL, they kind of have this cholesterol, like foundation, their framework, and they're kind of spent at this point. And so what ApoE is going to do is it's going to allow it to be taken up by the liver, kind of like clearing it. And this is actually present on all of the lipoprotein particles except for LDL. So the exception for ApoE is LDL. Good one to remember. So next, our last one, we have ApoA1. And I just think APO activator, that's my personal way of remembering it. It activates the LCAT, or the lecithin cholesterol acyltransferase. And it's basically an enzyme. The LCAT is an enzyme that esterifies or attaches free cholesterol on HDL particles. So it's kind of helping basically bring back like cholesterol on HDL back to the liver. So this is a good thing. You do want like ApoA1. It's going to be activating again LCAT, lecithin cholesterol transferase. And so it's just kind of getting the return process started. APO activator, ApoA1. Okay, so now let's go over the lipoprotein particles and their definitions. For clarity, what do all of these contain? Because there's the large lipoproteins, and they're going to contain the apolipoproteins. So, can you think what is a chylomicron? Just to really reinforce this. So these are coming from intestinal cells, and they deliver triglycerides to peripheral tissues. When they're depleted after delivering triglycerides, they're called chylomicron remnants, and they bring cholesterol to the liver. So they're returning it once they're done, once they're remnants. And what would be needed to return these remnants? What apolipoprotein would help the liver eat these up? Good. It'll be ApoE. ApoE is on chylomicrons. So next, we have our very low density lipoprotein, so our VLDLs. These are what? And where are they coming from? So these are the way that the liver packages triglycerides to send to our peripheral cells. So it's basically the liver's like central supply, and then it's able to send out all of these packages called VLDL, and they're going to need a kind of tag to be processed and absorbed. Remember that tag? Good, B100. And as these break down, they'll be broken down into intermediate density lipoproteins and eventually low density lipoproteins. So again, these are kind of getting smaller. So next, as we just mentioned, we have our IDL, which is smaller than VLDL, which makes sense as it's a breakdown product. It also has a higher apolipoprotein to triglyceride ratio, which makes sense as the triglycerides have been processed at this point. And it starts to return triglycerides and cholesterol to the liver because it also has ApoE as well. So next we have the LDL-C, also known as LDL. So this one is going to be smaller and denser than the intermediate density lipoprotein, or IDL, and it delivers hepatic cholesterol to peripheral tissues. So this one is bringing cholesterol from liver to the body. Does it have B100 or does it not? Yes, this very much has B100. It's very important for it to be uptaken. And so any issues with B100 could be problematic. And actually, this can happen. And that's why this is often known as kind of like a lousy or a lethal one. Just because like if this is elevated, it is associated with like atherosclerotic disease, and it can be problematic. So because of this, this key feature, there are medications like statins, PCSK9 inhibitors, and bempedoic acid can exploit changes here. And there's one unique thing about this LDL. Remember, it does not have something, one of these apolipoproteins. Which was that? Good. So it doesn't have ApoE. It's not basically being uptaken by the liver or the remnant uptake. Okay. So now we have HDL. This is the smallest, this is the most dense, and it has the most amount of apolipoprotein compared to triglyceride. And has a different function. What was that? Do you remember? Okay, so good. So it functions to recover cholesterol from the periphery and return it to the liver. It also has ApoC2 and ApoE that aid in catalyzing cleavage of triglycerides with lipoprotein lipase, and ApoE that aids in remnant uptake. So basically, this one is kind of like cleaning up. It's basically able to help cut and cleave. It'll be taken up by the liver and bring cholesterol back. So this one is a good one to have. If this one is low, that is generally seen as problematic. So last, I just wanted to throw in LP(a), as there are some other lipoproteins. And this one is a genetic independent risk factor for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, potentially independent from lifestyle modifications. And so basically you can see this number, if it may be elevated, that may be associated with higher risk. So there are currently some treatments in progress and in testing and research, but it's a developing field of study and less likely to be on your exam for now. So now that we've reviewed both the apolipoproteins and the larger lipoproteins, let's put the two together and do a brief review of which apolipoproteins are on each lipoprotein. So first, we have chylomicrons. So again, these are big. Remember, they're coming from the GI system. And what is big and what is needed to leave the GI system. So good, a B48, like a B48 bomber. And they're also going to have C2 to cut and cleave. And of course, it has an ApoE because the chylomicron remnants will be taken up. So just kind of put that one away. That one's kind of unique on its own just because it's before the liver. And so it will be taken up and is very large. So next, I have a little saying to help remember this. So listen closely. So VLDL has all three. IDL was lost at C, and LDL has lost its E. All 100% need this little rhyme to make it stick. So what that was which apolipoproteins are on which lipoproteins. So VLDL has three of them, B100, C2, and ApoE. So just remember that's your default, the VLDL from the liver. Next, IDL was lost at C, so it has no C2. Now next, LDL has lost its E, so LDL is a breakdown product of IDL, so it also lost its C2 and it lost its E. So really the only thing that LDL has is B100 to be taken up. So that's the easy one to remember, LDL, B100, remember that. And last, we have our HDL. This one, as mentioned, has our ApoC2, our ApoE, and our ApoA1. So remember that's got the APO activator for LCAT, and so that one's a little different. It's got its own role. But again, just like the one little rhyme to remember, VLDL has all three, IDL was lost at C, and LDL has lost its E. Feel free to write this down. It's pretty helpful, and it can kind of help process these. Okay, so now that we've gone over the apolipoproteins, let's go over some of the regulators of lipids, kind of some of the hormones. So let's start with a fasted state. These will be our catabolic processes. So when we don't have energy, what will happen? Can you name an enzyme that would help? So I think I may have mentioned it before, but we have hormone-sensitive lipase, and it's going to be helpful during fasting because what it does is it is an intracellular enzyme within adipocytes, so our fat cells, and it is going to be activated by the pKa. It's also going to be which is increased via epinephrine, glucagon, and then inversely inhibited by insulin, which makes sense. So this is our low energy states. And what it's going to do is it's going to start to cleave our stored fat, so our triglycerides. It's going to turn these triacylglycerols into diacylglycerols, monoacylglycerols, and these are then able to be processed via beta oxidation for the fatty acids or gluconeogenesis for the glycerol. So again, this is going to be in our energy need phase. So insulin is going to inhibit hormone-sensitive lipase because insulin promotes storage, not breakdown. So in a condition, this might be kind of a hard question, but in a condition like type 1 diabetes, how would this present? So if you were thinking you're going to be large amounts of breakdown of stored triglycerides from adipocytes, that would be correct. And so that'd be kind of like weight loss. You may have high blood sugar, but you overall would be losing adipocyte volume. So next, we have our hepatic lipase, and this is again for our catabolic states. It's synthesized by the hepatocytes, which is in the name, and then it is going to hydrolyze triglycerides and phospholipids and intermediate density lipoproteins, IDL, and chylomicron remnants. So basically, it helps convert these kind of like moderate sized one, the IDL, chylomicron remnants, into LDL for delivery of cholesterol during fasting. Okay, so those are two for fasting. Next, we have anabolic processes. When would this be done? Okay, good. So this is going to happen in basically post-meal, postprandial states, and it's going to be using things like lipoprotein lipase, which is basically an endothelial-bound enzyme in adipose tissue, muscle, and the heart. So think about these compounds, or so these organs, tissues that are going to be using energy or storing energy, and they're going to want to be using ApoC2. They're going to have that as a cofactor because they need to process the VLDL and all these other lipoproteins. They're also going to be hydrolyzing circulating chylomicrons, VLDL, like I said, into free fatty acids and glycerol, which can be used. So the free fatty acids will then be taken up for use. Next, we have pancreatic lipase. Like I said, this is going to be a strong one, and this one is going to be excreted in the duodenum, and it's going to basically cleave these for absorption. So, what about kind of some more neutral ones where we may have them happening as more of our baseline needs, not necessarily a fed or fasted state? One of those, if you have anything in mind, would be these cholesterol ester transfer proteins. One is SETP. It's cholesterol ester transfer protein, and it's basically like a currency swap between HDL, LDL, and VLDL. Technically, it's like mediating transfer of cholesterol esters between lipoprotein particles. So that one's just kind of swapping things. It'll be more of a neutral role. And then we also have LCAT, and that is lecithin cholesterol acyltransferase. And it is basically going to be activated by A1, like we said, on nascent HDL. So what that's going to do is it's going to esterify free cholesterol that's hanging around, and it'll do that using a fatty acid from phosphatidylcholine. Then what happens is that it matures the HDL and drives a reverse cholesterol transport. So basically, the LCAT is kind of like getting the HDL ready, and then it's going to be able to bring it back to the liver. So next we have something called PCSK9. You might have heard of the drug PCSK9 inhibitors. The name is not important, but if you're curious, it's proprotein convertase subtilisin kexin type 9. And basically, what it's going to do is it is a protease that binds LDL receptors on hepatocytes, and it targets them for lysosomal degradation, which is going to reduce receptor recycling. And why would this be important? Let's say you had high PCSK9 levels. So good. So it would basically start to remove the LDL receptors, and the LDL would remain high in the circulation. So that's why we have drugs called PCSK9 inhibitors. They're often called the CUMABs, and they help lower LDL. So moving along, those were kind of the different regulators. But let's say we're at the peripheral cell now, like we're kind of wanting to enter it. We've just been in circulation, all this processing from the liver, GI system, and then we're free fatty acids. So good news is these are easy to transport. And why would that be? Just because they're small, they're mostly lipophilic, and so they can cross the phospholipid bilayer without requiring much. And then triglycerides, like I said, they may need a little bit of processing, but again, they can be pretty easily broken down and transported. So moving on, let's say we've come across the phospholipid bilayer. Now, how do we get across the mitochondrial membrane? Because we're in the cytoplasm, so it kind of depends. So for short and medium chain fatty acids, they can just diffuse freely since they're small, and they're pretty uninhibited. On the other hand, we have some long chain fatty acids. There's going to be like mini carbons long, and they're going to require a shuttle. Do you remember the specific name of the shuttle? I like to think of it as them having a car. It's like called the carnitine shuttle, and it's basically to get them across the inner mitochondrial membrane. So the way it works is you have the fatty acids, and they're going to be activated by fatty acyl-CoA on the outer mitochondrial membrane by acyl-CoA synthetase. So just think about these are on the outside. They need a fatty acyl-CoA, or they're activated to that, and that's going to get them across. Next, there's carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, CPT1. That basically is going to transfer an acyl group, and it's going to get that in the process of just shuttling across. Next, there's carnitine acyl carnitine translocase. It's just translocating it. And then last but not least, you have CPT2 or carnitine palmitoyl transferase 2. So this will bring it back basically into the mitochondria. So a lot of details there, a lot of names, but more than anything, what is the overall goal of this? Why are we bringing like these very long chain fatty acids into the mitochondria? Okay, good. So we're making like acetyl-CoA, and that can be used for like the use in the TCA cycle or ketogenesis. So we really need just more of our energy processing. We need to get them there. And then later we'll go about the reverse. Like if we have high energy, how do we create triacylglycerols? How do we do the opposite? So there is one little potentially testable point here. Um, Theoretically, would there be something that could regulate this process? You know, potentially a high end product or something like that. If you don't know this, that's okay. But there's one called malonyl CoA. It's a product of acetyl-CoA carboxylase, or the committed step in fatty acid synthesis. So in more of a high energy state, again with fatty acid synthesis. So in a high energy state, you might see more malonyl CoA, and this would allosterically inhibit the first step of this process, CPT1, carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1. So the carnitine shuttle would be halted if you have already high energy state, is the high yield there. Okay, so this is also a great point. There are a couple other issues that can go wrong here. Um, so let's see. Let's say we had an issue with that carnitine shuttle. What would that look like? What type of symptoms could that lead to? Okay. So yeah, if you were thinking along the lines of like low energy, that would be great. We do have a condition called primary carnitine deficiency, and it's going to be an issue again with those long chain fatty acids getting into mitochondria. So they're not going to be able to enter, so they're going to accumulate. They're just going to be sitting in the cytoplasm and not be able to use for energy. So you're going to have a fatigue. You're going to have hypotonia. You're going to have myopathy. You're going to have ketotic hypoglycemia. Again, because we can't make these ketones, you can't break these products down, and so you just have really low energy. And this can be treated though, fortunately, and that would just actually just be to replace the carnitine so you can get the shuttle functioning again. So similar to that, can you imagine any other issues along the shuttle? So if you were thinking one of the CPTs, that would be great. That would also lead to an issue with processing of the very long chain fatty acids. And then additionally, this would cause some issues with gluconeogenesis because acetyl-CoA is an allosteric activator of pyruvate carboxylase. So without the acetyl-CoA, the liver is going to struggle to convert lactate and alanine to glucose, and it also lacks the ATP NADH normally provided by beta oxidation. So you've got like a few different steps there that are going to be problematic. Like you don't have energy, you don't have the acetyl-CoA, and so gluconeogenesis also will have some issues. And so that's why we have the hypoglycemia, additionally, with the hypoketosis as well. So, last but not least, we have the medium chain acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiency. Do you remember what this issue is? It's kind of in the name even. So, okay, so good. So it's a defective beta oxidation of medium chain fatty acids due to a defect in the first step of the process. And similarly to the others, you're going to have non-ketotic hypoglycemia, lethargy, seizures, encephalopathy during fasting. And for this reason, MCAT is part of newborn screening panels. You might also see some mild hepatomegaly and liver dysfunction. So I mentioned it briefly in the introduction, but how can this be diagnosed? What do you think you would see if you have a medium chain enzyme basically deficiency? So if you were thinking along the lines of you had like an accumulation of the 8 to 10 carbon acyl carnitines in blood, that would be correct. And that's a clear feature of this disease, is you should be able to detect those. And then kind of a follow-up question to that is, would this show up right at birth? Like, we do it as a screening, or would it appear later? Okay, so logically, it would probably appear later. If we're doing a screening, probably don't have symptoms, assuming they're well fed. But if we had like prolonged fasting for whatever reason, when the body's relying more on that fat metabolism and ketone production, that's when the issues are going to become obvious because we're not able to create the ketones, we're not able to break down the fats and gluconeogenesis. So, while we're on the topic of ketone production, just kind of quick points. What is the rate limiting step of this process? It's an enzyme. I'll give you that. So it's similarly named to the enzyme that statins work on, but this one is mitochondrial HMG CoA synthase. Not reductase, but synthase. So again, it's mitochondrial HMG CoA synthase. It basically is a key enzyme for controlling your rate of ketogenesis. So again, that's going to be important in those fasting states because they can be broken down and used as energy as well. So there are a couple interesting quirks or interesting things about ketones. Do you know where they're made? Okay, if you said liver, good. But what's interesting is it doesn't use it because it doesn't have a special enzyme, actually. It doesn't have one called deophorase. And so it makes them, but it doesn't use them. Additionally, there's another type of cell. It doesn't have any mitochondria, so it's reliant on glycolysis, so it's not going to be using ketones. That would be red blood cells. So for the most part, everything else is able to switch over to ketones and use those. Okay, so now that we mentioned ketones, let's talk about a little bit more about where they're made. So we said they're made in the liver, right? And they're also going to be using mitochondrial HMG-CoA synthase, which will be the rate limiting step. What about if we had low insulin or high glucagon? What would that do? So low insulin, high glucagon, that means kind of we need some energy. That's going to be promoting beta oxidation, gluconeogenesis, and that's indirectly going to increase activity of HMG-CoA synthase. So that'll increase our ketone production, kind of a low energy state. So as we're breaking down fats, we're going to get beta oxidation. That's going to create some acetyl-CoA. And what that's going to do is it's going to deplete oxaloacetate that's used for gluconeogenesis. And kind of remember, this is the very start of the TCA cycle where the two will combine. The details are less important here, but basically just know that the sequence of events will cause ketones to be made more and more as long as acetyl-CoA is high, kind of like when you're in a fasting state, and when oxaloacetate is low when it's being used from gluconeogenesis. So know that there's kind of some regulation of why a low energy state will lead to ketogenesis. So similarly, if there were a deficiency in HMG-CoA synthase, how would it present? So good. So there would basically be no ketones. And if there are no ketones, there would be very low energy. You'd be hypoketotic. In fact, it'd probably be similar to MCAD. You'd have hypoglycemia. You'd have risk of seizures. During fasting, of course, these are the low energy states. But what would you not have during this? Potentially at labs. How would you differentiate this deficiency of HMG-CoA synthase from MCAD? So good. So MCAD would have the medium chain acylcarnitines, but this would not. Okay, so I think we covered that well. Next, I want to just briefly cover on building triglycerides. Big picture, we need those building blocks, glycerol, and then we need the fatty acids. So if we have any issues with this, with any enzymes constructing these, you won't be able to produce them correctly, and you wouldn't be able to have lipogenesis occurring. So in this process of lipogenesis, we do have another shuttle, and it's going to be used to transfer acetyl-CoA from the mitochondria out to the cytoplasm. So it'll be the reverse of what we did before, but this is useful because it's going to be able to build these triglycerides within the adipocytes. Do you remember what that's called? I like to think of it as synthesis. For synthesis, you need the citrate shuttle. So it's going to get those S sounds. You'll need a citrate shuttle for synthesis of triglycerides. And this is again going from mitochondria to the cytoplasm. So just to recap, kind of overall big things from this episode, let's go over some of the highest yield points again for repetition. So what is an apolipoprotein? So these are the proteins that help process and metabolize lipids throughout the body. Good. So these are like B100, ApoB100, ApoC2, things like that. Next, what do chylomicrons do? Okay, so they carry dietary fat, and they also have a unique apolipoprotein, B48, B48 bomber. It's coming from your diet. Okay, so next we have VLDLs, and then the following smaller lipoproteins, IDL and LDL. And they have what? Which apolipoprotein? Good. So these 100% need B100 to be taken up, and they're all coming from the liver. Good. So next we have, kind of like what we just mentioned, LDL. This one, again, is unique because it'll be ferrying cholesterol to the peripheral tissues. But if we have too much of this, it's kind of lousy, maybe lethal even. So just remember your L's. And if it's dysregulated, this is not a great one to have if it's too high. Next, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the smallest one, and this is called high density lipoprotein. And what does it do? What's its function? Good. So it's going to bring back cholesterol from the peripheral tissues and bring it back to the liver, where it's going to be able to be processed there. So that one you do not want to be too low for reference. Okay, what are a couple of hormones that can regulate some of these processes? Just kind of big picture. Okay, if you're thinking insulin and glucagon, other stress hormones that regulate lipid status, that would be correct. They do more than just carbohydrate regulation as well. So We just talked about a shuttle that is going to be essential for fatty acid synthesis, coming from the mitochondria to the cytoplasm. And that was called the citrate shuttle. And then additionally, on the other end, from going from the cytoplasm to the mitochondria, we need a car to get in, and that is going to be our carnitine shuttle. So overall, lipids are important structurally and for energy, but they must be in balance. When we get dysregulation, that's where we kind of have some of the clinical manifestations that come up. In fact, we'll see some more of those in the next episode. So last but not least, to answer the opening vignette, we know that an issue with processing medium chain fatty acids would likely lead to a hypoglycemic, hypoketotic state in an individual after fasting. So when they're fasting, they don't have the medium chain acyl-CoA dehydrogenase, the specific enzyme. You just need to recognize MCAD. And if this is deficient, you're going to have the classic symptoms of MCAD, such as lethargy, seizures, and vomiting. Thank you for listening this far. If you found this episode helpful today, please take a moment to consider subscribing to our podcast. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please visit our website at spoonfulofsugar.org and post them under the link for this episode. Good luck with your studying, and remember that if you ever have an SOS moment while studying, a spoonful of sugar is always here to help the medicine go down.